A Bitter Root Billingsrbiter. By Rex Ellingwood Beach. Billings rode in from the junction about dusk, and ate his supper in silence. He'd been east for 60 days, and, although there lurked about him the hint of unwanted ventures, etiquette forbade its mention. You see, in our country, that which a man gives voluntarily is ofttimes later dissected in smoky bunkhouses, or roughly handled round flickering campfires, but the privacies he guards are inviolate. Curiosity isn't exactly a lost art, but its practice isn't popular nor hygienic. Later, I found him meditatively whittling out on the porch, and, as the moment seemed propitious, I inquired adroitly did you have a good time in Chicago, Bitter Root? Bully, said he, relapsing into weighty absorption. What'd you do? I inquired with almost the certainty of appearing insistent. Don't you never read the papers? He inquired, with such evident compassion that Kink Martin and the other boys snickered. This from Bitter Root, who scorns literature outside of the Arkansas printing, as he terms the illustrations. Guess I'll have to show you my press notices, and from a hip pocket he produced a fat bundle of clippings in a rubber band. These he displayed jealously, and I stared agape, for they were front pages of great metropolitan dailies, marred with red and black scare heads, in which I glimpsed the words, Billings, of Montana, Bitter Root on arbitration, a Lachinvar out of the West, and other things as puzzling. Press notices, echoed Kink scornfully. Wouldn't that rope yet? He talks like Big Ike that went with the Wild West show. When a puncher gets so lazy he can't earn a living by the sweat of his pony, he grows his hair, goes on the stage busting glass balls with shot cartridges and talks about press notices. Let's see Billings. You pinch as close to your stomach as though you held cards in a strange poker game. Well, I have sat in a strange game, amongst aliens, said Billings, disregarding the request, and I've held the high cards, also I've drawed out with honors. I've sailed the medium-high seas with mutiny in the stoke hold, I've changed the laws of labor, politics, and municipal economies. I went out of God's country right into the heart of the decaying East, and by the application of a run and noose in a hemp rope I strangled oppression and put 8,000 men to work. He paused ponderously. I'm an arbitrator. The deuce you are, indignantly cried Reddy the cook. Who says so? Reddy isn't up in syntax, and his unreasoning loyalty to Billings is an established fact of such standing that his remarks afford no conjecture. Yes, I've cut into the nation's peril and the cryin' evil good and strong walkin' out from the stinks of the Union stockyards, of Chicago, into the limelight of publicity, via the drunk and disorderly route. You see I got those 10 carloads of steers into the city all right, but I was so blame busy splatterin' through the tracked up wastes of the cow pens, and inhalin' the sewer gas of the west side that I never got to see a newspaper. If I'd a read one, here's what I'd a found, namely, the greatest, stubbornest, riotinous strike ever known, which means a heap for Chicago, she being the wet nurse of labor trouble. The whole riverfront was tied up. Nary a steamer had whistled inside the 6-mile crib for 2 weeks, and 8,000 men was out. There was hold UPS and bloodsheddin' and picketin', which last is an alias for assault with intents, and altogether it was a prime place for a cowman, on a quiet vacation just homelike and natural. It was at this point that I enters, bustin' out of the smoke of the stockyards, all sweet and beautiful, like the gentle heroine in the play as she walks through the curtains at the back of the stage. Now you know there's a heap of difference between the stockyards and Chicago. It's just like coming from Arkansas over into the United States. Well, soon as I sold the stock I hit for the lakefront and began to ground sluice the coal dust off of my palate. I was busy working my booze hydraulic when I see an arid apparent pilgrim longside lookin' thirsty as an alkali flat. Get in, says I, and the way he obeyed orders looked like he'd had military training. I felt sort of drawn to him from the way he handled his liquor, took it straight and runnin' over, then sopped his hands on the bar and smelled of his fingers. He seemed to just soak it up both ways, reg'lar human blotter. You lap it up like a man, says I, like a cowman full growed ever been west. Nope, says he, born here. Well, I'm a stranger, says I, out absorbin' such beauties of architecture and free lunch as offers along the line. If I ain't keepin' you up, I'd be glad of your company. I'm your assistant lunch buster, says he, and in the course of things he further explained that he was a tugboat fireman, out on a strike, givin' me the full errand information about the tie-up dash. It all come up over a dose of dyspepsia. Back up, interrupted Kink squirming, are you plum bug? Get together. You're certainly the raving kid. Ya must have stone bruised your heel and got concession of the brain. Yes sir. Indigestion, Billings continued. Old man Badrich, of the Badrich Transportation Company has it terrible. It lands on his solar every morning about 9 o'clock, gettin' worse steady, and reaches perihelion along about 11. He can tell the time of day by taste. One morning when his mouth felt like about 10:45 in comes a committee from Firemen and Engineers Local Number 21, with a demand for more wages, proddin' him with the intimations that if he didn't ante they'd tie up all his boats. I suppose a teaspoonful of baking soda, assimilated internally around the environments of his appendix would have spared the strike and cheated me out of being a hero. As the poet might have said, upon such slender pegs as this, our greatness hung. Oh, God, exclaimed Mulling, piously. Anyhow, the bitterness in the old man's inner tubes showed in the bile of his answer, and he told em if they wanted more money he'd give em a chance to earn it they could work nights as well as days. He intimated further that they'd ought to be satisfied with their wages as they'd undoubtedly foller the same line of business in the next world, and wouldn't get a cent for feedin' the fires neither. Next mornin' the strike was called, and the guy that breathed treachery and walkouts was one O'Lehegan, further submerged under the titles of President of the Federation of Freshwater Firemen, also Chairman of the United Waterfront Workmen, which last takes in everything doin' business along the river except the wharf rats and typhoid germs, and it's with the disreputableness of this party that I infected myself to the detriment of labor and the triumph of the law. D. O'Harahegan is an able man, and inside of a week he'd spread the strike till it was the cleanest, dirtiest tie-up ever known. The hospitals and morgues was full of non-union men, but the river was empty all right. Yes, he had a persuadin' method of arbitration quite convincing to the most calloused, involving the layin' on of the lead pipe. Things got to be pretty fierce by and by, for they had the police buffaloed, and disturbances got plentier than the casualties at a butcher's picnic. The strikers got hungry, too, finally, because the principles of unionism is like a rash on your mechanic, skin deep inside, his gastrix works 3 shifts a day even if his outsides is idle and steaming with socialism. Oily fed dray loads of eloquence, but it didn't seem to be real fillin'. They'd leave the lectures and rob a bakery. He was a wonder though, just sat in his office, and kept the ship owners waitin' in line, swearin' bitter and refined cuss words about ignorant fiend and cussed pedagogue, which last, for Kink's enlightenment, means a kind of Hebrew meetin' house. These here details my new friend give me, ending with a eulogy on O'Lehegan, the idol of the idol. If he says starve, we starve, says he, and if he says work, we work. See? Oh, he's the goods, he is. Let's go down by the river, maybe we'll see him. So me and Murdoch hiked down Water Street, where they keep mosquito netting over the bar fixtures and spit at the stove. We found him, a big-mouthed, shifty, kind of man, 'bout as cynical lookin' in the face as a black bass, and full of wind as a toadfish. I exchanged drinks for principles of socialism, and doin' so happened to display my role. Murdoch slipped away and made talk with a friend, then, when Hegan had left, he steers me out the back way into an alley. Short cut, says he to another and a better place. I follers through a back room, then as I steps out the door I'm grabbed by this new friend, while Murdoch bathes my head with a gas pipe billy, one of the regulation, strike promoting kind, like they use for decoyin' members into the glorious ranks of labor. I saw a burning of Rome that was a dream, and whole cloudbursts of shootin' stars, but I yanked Mr. Enthusiastic Stranger away from my single and throwed him in the wall. In the shuffle Murdoch shifts my ballasts though, and steams up the alley with my greenbacks, convoyed by his friend. Wow, says I, give in the distress signal so that the windows rattled, and reach in for my holster. I'd a got them both, only the gun caught in my suspender. You see, not anticipatin' any live bird shoot, I'd put it inside my pants band, under my vest, for appearances. A 45 is like fresh air to a drowning man, generally has to be drawed in haste, and neither one shouldn't be mislaid. I got her out at last and blazed away, just a second after they dodged around the comber. Then I hit the trail after 'em, letting go a few sky shots and getting a ghost dance holler off my stomach that had been troubling me. The wallop on the head made me dizzy though, and I zigzagged awful, tacking out of the alley right into a policeman. "We," says I, enjoy, for he had Murdoch safe by the bits, buckin' considerable. "Stand aside and le madame lectrocute 'im," says I. I throwed the gun on him and the crowd dogged it into all the doorways and windows convenient, but I was so weak-minded in the knees I stumbled over the curb and fell down. Next thing I knew we was all bouncin' over the cobblestones in a patrol wagon. Well, in the morning I told my story to the judge, plain and unvarnished. Then Murdoch takes the stand and busts into song, claiming that he was comin' through the alley toward Clark Street when I staggered out back of a saloon and commenced to shoot at him. He saw I was drunk, and fanned out, me shootin' at him with every jump. He had proof, he said, and he called for the president of his union, Mr. Hegan. At the name all the loafers and stew bums in the courtroom stomped and said, "Here, here," while up steps this Napoleon of the hobos. Sure, he knew Mr. Murdoch had known him for years, and he was perfectly reliable and honest. As to his robbing me, it was preposterous, because he himself was at the other end of the alley and saw the whole thing, just as Mr. Murdoch related it. I jumps up. "You're a liar, Hegan. I was buyin' booze for the two of you, but a policeman nailed me, chokin' off my rhetorics." Mr. Hegan leans over and whispers to the judge, while I got chilblains along my spine. "Look here, kind judge," says I, real winning and genteel, "this man is so good at explainin' things away, ask him to talk off this bump over my ear. I surely didn't get a buggy spoke and laminate myself on the nut." "That'll do," says the judge. "Mr. Clerk, $10 and costs charge, drunk and disorderly. Next." "Hold on there," says I, ignorant of the involutions of justice, "I guess I've got the bulge on you this time. They beat you to me, Judge. I ain't got a cent. You can go through me and be welcome to half you find. I'll mail you 10 when I get home though, honest." At that the audience giggled, and the judge says, "Your humor doesn't appeal to me, Billings. Of course, you have the privilege of working it out." "Oh, glory, the privilege." Hegan nodded at this, and I realized what I was against. "Your Honor," says I with sarcastic refinements, "science tells us that a perfect vacuum ain't possible, but after watching you I know better, and for you, Mr. Workingman's friend, dash us to the floor," and I run at Hegan. Pshaw. I never got started, nor I didn't rightfully come to till I rested in the workhouse, which last figure of speech is a pure and beautiful paradox. I ain't dwellin' with glee on the next 26 days, $10 and costs, at 4 bits a day, but I left there saturated with such hatreds for Hegan that my breath smelted of 'em. I wanders down the river front, hoping the fortunes of war would deliver him to me dead or alive, when the thought hit me that I'd need money. It was bound to take another 10 and costs shortly after we met, and probably more, if I paid for what I got, for I figured on distendin' myself with satisfaction and his features with uppercuts. Then I see a sign, "Non-union men wanted, big wages." In I goes, and strains my language through a wire net at the cashier. "I want them big wages," says I. "What can you do?" "Anything to get the money," says I. "What does it take to liquidate an assault on a labor leader?" There was a white-haired man in the cage who began to sit up and take notice. "What's your trouble?" says he, and I told him. "If we had a few more like you, we'd bust the strike," says he, kind of sizing me up. "I've got a notion to try it anyhow," and he smites the desk. "Collins, what do ye say if we tow the Detroit out? Her crew has stayed with us so far, and they'll stick now if we'll say the word. The unions are hungry and scrapping among themselves, and the men want to go back to work. It's just that devil of a Hegan that holds 'em. If they see we've got a tug crew that'll go, they'll arbitrate, and we'll kill the strike." "Yes, sir," says Collins, "but where's the tug crew, Mr. Badrich?" "Right here. We three, and Murphy, the bookkeeper." "Blast this idleness. I want to fight." "I'll take the same," says I, "when I get the price." "That's all right. You've put the spirit into me, and I'll see you through. Can you run an engine?" "Good. I'll take the wheel, and the others'll fire. It's going to be risky work, though. You won't back out, eh?" Reddy interrupted Billings here loudly, with a snort of disgust, while Bitterroot ran his fingers through his hair before continuing. Martin was listening intently. "The old man arranged to have a squad of cops on all the bridges, and I begin anticipating hilarities for next day. The news got out, of course, through the secrecies of police headquarters, and when we ran up the river for our tow, it looked like every striker west of Pittsburgh had his family on the docks to see the barbecue, accompanied by enough cobblestones and scrap iron to ballast a battleship. All we got going up was repartee, but I figured we'd need armor getting back. We passed a hawser to the Detroit, and I turned the gas into the tug, blowing for the Wells Street Bridge. Then war began. I leans out the door just in time to see the mob charge the bridge. The cops clubbed 'em back, while a roar went up from the docks and rooftops that was like a bad dream. I couldn't see her move none though, and old man Badrich blowed again, expurgating himself of as nobby a line of cuss words as you'll muster outside the cattle belt. "Soak 'em," I yells, "give 'em all the arbitration you've got handy. If she don't open, we'll jump her," and I lets out another notch, so that we went plowing and boiling towards the draw. It looked like we'd have to hurdle it sure enough, but the police beat the crowd back just in time. She wasn't clear open though, and our barge caromed off the spiles. It was like a nigger butt in a persimmon tree. We rattled off a shower of missiles like an abnormal hailstorm. Talk about your coast defense, they heaved everything at us from bad names to railroad iron, and we lost all our window glass the first clatter, while the smokestack looked like a pretzel with cramps. When we scraped through, I looked back with pity at the Detroit's crew. She hadn't any wheelhouse, and the helmsman was due to get all the attention that was comin' to him. They'd built up a barricade of potato sacks, chicken coops, and bric-a-brac around the wheel that protected 'em somewhat, but even while I watched, some Polak filtered a brick through and laid out the quartermaster cold, and he was drug off. Oh! It was refined and aesthetic. Well, we run the gauntlet, presented every block with stuff ranging in tensile strength from insults to asphalt pavements, and noise, say, all the racket in the world was a whisper. I caught a glimpse of the old man leaning out of the pilot house, where a window had been, his white hair bristly, and his nostrils hissed, embellishing the air with surprise and flights of gleeful profanity. "Hooray! This is livin'," he yells, spying me shoveling the deck out from under the junk. "Best scrap I've had in years," and just then some baseball player throwed in from center field, catching him in the neck with a tomato. Gee! That man's an honor to the faculty of speech. I was doin' bully till a cobblestone bounced into the engine room, makin' a billiard with my off knee, then I got kind of peevish. Rush Street Bridge is the last one, and they'd massed there on both sides, like fleas on a razorback. Thinks I, if we make it through here, we busted the strike, and I glances back at the Detroit just in time to see her crew pullin' their captain into the deck house, limp and bleedin'. The barricade was all knocked to pieces and they'd flunked absolute. Don't blame 'em much either, as it was sure death to stand out in the open under the rain of stuff that come from the bridges. Of course with no steering she commenced to swing off. I jumps out the far side of the engine room and yells fit to bust my throat. "Grab that wheel. Grab it quick, we'll hit the bridge," but it was like deaf and dumb talk in a boiler shop, while a wilder howl went up from the waterfront as they seen what they'd done and smelled victory. There's an awfulness about the voice of a blood-maddened club swingin' mob, it lifts your scalp like a fright wig, particularly if you are the clubby. We've got one chance, thinks I, but if she strikes we're gone. They'll swamp us sure, and all the police in Cook County won't save enough for to hold services on. Then I throwed a look at the opening ahead and the pessimisms froze in me. I forgot all about the resiliency of brickbats and the table manners of riots, for there, on top of a bunch of spiles, masterful and bloated with perjuries, was Oily Hegan dictating the disposition of his forces, the light of victory in his shifty, little eyes. $10 and costs, I shrieks, seein' red. Lemme crawl up them spiles to you. Then inspiration seized me. My soul riz up and grappled with the crisis, for right under my MIT, coiled, suggestive and pleadin', was one of the tug's heaven lines, 'bout a 3/8 size. I slips a runnin' knot in the end and divides the coils, crouchin' behind the deck house till we come abeam of him, then I straightened, give it a swinging heave, and the noose sailed up and settled over him fine and daisy. I jerked back, and Oily Hegan did a high dive from Rush Street that was a geometrical joy. He hit kind of amateurish, doin' what we used to call a belly buster back home, but quite satisfyin' for a maiden effort, and I reeled him in astern. Your Chicago man ain't a gamey fish. He come up tame and squirting sewage like a dissolute porpoise, while I played him out where he'd get the thrash of the propeller. Help, he yells, I'm a drownding. $10 and costs, says I, lettin' him under again. Do you know who you're drinkin' with this time, hey? I reckon the astonishment of the mob was equal to Hegan's, anyhow I'm told that we was favored with such quietness that my voice sounded 4 blocks, simply atchin' with satisfactions. Then pandemonium tore loose, but I was so engrossed in sweet converse I never heard it or noticed that the Detroit had slid through the draw by a hair, and we was bound for the blue and smilin' lake. For God's sake, lemme up, says Hegan, splashin' along and lookin' strangly. I hauls him in where he wouldn't miss any of my ironies, and says dash. I just can't do it, Oily, it's wash day. You're plumb nasty with boycotts and picketin's and compulsory arbitrations. I'm goin' to clean you up, and I sozzled him under like a wet shirt. I drug him out again and continues dash. This is Chinaman's work, Oily, but I lost my pride in the bridewell, thanks to you. It's tough on St. Louis to laundry you upstream this way, but maybe the worst of your heresies LL be purified when they get that far. You know the Chicago River runs uphill out of Lake Michigan through the drainage canal and into the St. Louis waterworks. Sure it does, most unnatural stream I ever see about direction and smells. I was gettin' a good deal of enjoyment and infections out of him when old man Badrich ran back enameled with blood and passé tomato juice, the red in his white hair makin' his top look like one of these fancy ice cream drinks you get at a soda fountain. Here. Here. You'll kill him, says he, so I hauled him aboard, drippin' and clingy, wringin' him out good and thorough by the neck. He made a fine mop. These clippings, continued Bitterroot, fishing into his pocket, tell in beautiful figures how the last scene of Oily Hegan he was wholly stoning the deck of a sooty little tugboat under the admonishments and feet of Bitterroot Billings of Montana, and they state how the strikers tried to get tugs for pursuit and couldn't, and how, all day long, from the housetops was visible a tugboat madly cruisin' about inside the outer cribs, bustin' the silence with joyful blasts of victory, and they'll further state that about dark she steamed up the river, tired and draggled, with a bony-lookin' cowboy inhalin' cigarettes on the stern bitts, holding a 3-foot knotted rope in his lap. When a delegation of strikers met her, inquirin' about one D. O'Hara Hegan, it says like this, and Billings read laboriously as follows dash. Then the bronzed and lanky man arose with a smile of rare contentment, threw overboard his cigarette, and approaching the boiler room hatch, called loudly, "Come out of that," and the president of the Federation of Freshwater Firemen dragged himself wearily out into the flickering lights. He was black and drenched and streaked with sweat, also, he shone with the grease and oils of the engines, while the palms of his hands were covered with painful blisters from unwanted, intimate contact with shovels and drawbars. It was seen that he winced fearfully as the cowboy twirled the rope end. "He's got the makins of a fair fireman," said the stranger, "all he wants is practice." Then, as the delegation murmured angrily, he held up his hand and, in the ensuing silence, said, "Boys, the strike's over. Mr. Hegan has arbitrated."